I looked out my window and froze. Dozens of strangers were walking across my private land, laughing, taking photos, acting like they owned it. Then I found out the truth. An HOA I was not even a member of was selling paid tours through my property and keeping the money. No permission. No legal rights. When I told them to stop, they threatened me and claimed it was community land. That's when I decided to stop arguing and start collecting evidence. Because they didn't just trespass, they picked a fight with the law. And what happened next destroyed the HOA completely. For most of my adult life, I believed land was freedom. Not the poetic kind people post about online, but the real, tangible kind, the kind where you wake up knowing no one can tell you what to do with your own dirt. That belief was the entire reason I bought my property in the first place. Acres of quiet land on the edge of a planned community, separated by old trees, fencing, and one very clear boundary line that had existed long before the neighborhood's HOA ever did. I wasn't part of the HOA. I never had been. I never would be. That distinction mattered more than I realized. My land had once belonged to a farmer decades earlier. When developers arrived, they carved up the surrounding area into tidy lots, added manicured sidewalks, decorative street lamps, and, of course, an HOA with pages upon pages of rules. But my parcel remained separate. It was sold independently, recorded independently, taxed independently, and most importantly, governed independently. Or so I thought. The first sign something was wrong came on a quiet Saturday morning. I noticed tire tracks cutting through the grass near the back edge of my property. At first, I assumed it was a lost delivery driver or a curious neighbor who'd wandered too far. It wasn't uncommon for people to mistake my tree line for public green space, though most corrected themselves once they saw the fencing and signage. But then it happened again. And again. Soon, the tire tracks were joined by footprints. Dozens of them. Flattened grass. Broken branches. The unmistakable signs of repeated foot traffic across land that wasn't supposed to have any. I walked the perimeter, confused and increasingly irritated. My no trespassing signs were still there, though one had been turned slightly, as if someone had deliberately twisted it away from view. The gate near the dirt access path had been opened and closed so often that the latch was wearing thin. Still, I didn't jump to conclusions. Not yet. That changed when I saw people. One afternoon, I looked out toward the tree line and noticed a group of strangers walking in a neat cluster across my land. They weren't wandering or lost. They were organized. Purposeful. Some held phones up, others pointed toward the creek that ran through the lower portion of my property. At the front of the group was a woman wearing a bright visor and a self-satisfied posture that radiated authority. I didn't recognize her personally, but I recognized the type immediately. HOA Karen. She walked like the land already belonged to her. I stood there for a moment, genuinely stunned. Then I did what any reasonable property owner would do. I documented everything. Photos. Videos. Timestamps. License plates. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't shout or wave my arms. I just watched as at least 20 people completed a slow, deliberate walk across my private land, guided by someone who acted like she had every right to be there. Later that evening, I found the listing. It took less than 10 minutes of searching neighborhood social media pages. Buried in a cheerful post on the HOA's official community page was an announcement advertising historic nature walks through community-owned preserved land. The post was written in glowing language, promising scenic views, peaceful trails, and exclusive access available only through the HOA. There was a small fee per person. Every word of it was a lie. The land they were advertising wasn't community-owned. It wasn't preserved by the HOA. It wasn't subject to their authority in any way. It was mine. Deeded, recorded, surveyed, and paid for in full by me alone. What shocked me most wasn't just the audacity. It was the confidence. The post had comments thanking the HOA president by name for organizing the tours. People were tagging friends, asking when the next one would be scheduled, praising the HOA for protecting local history. The HOA Karen I'd seen leading the group wasn't just some busybody neighbor. She was the HOA president. I spent that night reviewing my paperwork. The original deed. The survey maps. The county records. Everything was exactly as I remembered. My property lines were crystal clear. The HOA boundary stopped several hundred feet short of my land. There were no easements. No shared access agreements. No legal gray areas. What they were doing wasn't a misunderstanding. It was trespassing. And worse than that, it was monetized trespassing. Over the next week, the tours continued. Twice during weekdays. Once on the weekend. Groups varied in size, but the pattern was the same. The same route. The same talking points. The same confident march across land they had no right to touch. With each tour, the damage increased. The grass near the creek was trampled into mud. Wildlife began avoiding the area entirely. One group even left behind trash, water bottles, and snack wrappers tossed casually into the brush. I contacted the HOA formally. I sent a certified letter addressed to the board, outlining my ownership, enclosing copies of the survey, and demanding immediate cessation of all use of my land. I was polite, professional, clear. They ignored it. I sent a second letter, this time through my attorney. That one got a response. The HOA's reply was dripping with arrogance. They claimed the land had been historically used by the community and was therefore subject to implied access. They suggested that my fencing was new and potentially non-compliant. They even implied that refusing access could be considered hostile to community interests. Not once did they deny running the tours. Not once did they acknowledge my ownership. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about land. It was about control. The HOA president had decided that because my property existed near her domain, it belonged to her narrative. She had sold access to something she didn't own, collected money she had no right to collect, and built a reputation around authority she didn't legally possess. And she wasn't planning to stop. The following weekend, I watched from a distance as the largest tour yet made its way onto my land. Nearly 40 people. Some carrying professional cameras. A drone buzzing overhead briefly before disappearing behind the trees. That drone crossed the line. I contacted my attorney that same afternoon and gave a simple instruction. We were done asking. We were going to court. As filings began and evidence was compiled, the HOA continued operating as if nothing was wrong. Tickets were sold. Tours were promoted. The HOA president even boasted online about defending community access against greedy landowners. She never mentioned my name. She didn't have to. Because by the time she realized what she'd actually done, by the time she understood that I wasn't an HOA member, that I wasn't subject to her rules, and that courts cared far more about deeds than opinions, it would already be too late. And that realization was coming. The moment the lawsuit was filed, everything changed, and yet, somehow, nothing did. The HOA was officially served. The president received notice not just as a representative of the board, but as the individual who had personally organized, advertised, and profited from the tours. The documents were clear, precise, and backed by indisputable evidence. Property records. Surveys. Photographs. Videos. Dates. Financial trails. From a legal standpoint, it was airtight. From the HOA standpoint, it was apparently offensive. Rather than stopping the tours immediately, the board doubled down. They framed the lawsuit as an attack on the community. Emails went out to residents warning them that a hostile landowner was trying to take away a beloved neighborhood feature. Donations were solicited to fund the HOA's legal defense. Posts appeared online painting me as someone who hated neighbors, nature, and shared spaces. What they never mentioned was that the shared space wasn't theirs. Behind the scenes, the HOA president attempted a quieter strategy. She contacted adjacent landowners, fishing for statements that might imply historical use. She dug through decades-old aerial photos, hoping to find any blurry evidence of footpaths that could be twisted into an easement claim. She even tried to argue that because the land had been open and accessible for years, it had somehow defaulted into communal property. That argument collapsed the moment it met reality. Accessibility is not ownership. Silence is not consent. And trespassing does not become legal just because enough people do it for long enough without being challenged. As discovery progressed, the true scope of the HOA's actions came into focus. Financial records revealed that the tours were not just a casual community activity. They were a steady revenue stream. Tickets were sold through HOA-managed platforms. Funds were deposited into accounts labeled as community programming, then quietly redistributed toward landscaping projects, board stipends, and administrative perks. The HOA president had personally approved every transaction. Worse still, none of the tour participants were informed that the land was privately owned. They were led to believe it was preserved community property, protected and maintained by the HOA. That misrepresentation wasn't just unethical, it was legally actionable. The turning point came during depositions. Stripped of newsletters, social media posts, and supportive neighbors, the HOA president was left with facts. And facts were not on her side. Under oath, she admitted she had never verified ownership of the land before organizing the tours. She assumed that because the land wasn't actively developed, it was either abandoned or communal. She acknowledged receiving my initial letter and choosing not to act on it because she believed the HOA's authority would prevail. Authority, it turned out, does not override property law. When asked why the tours continued after the lawsuit was filed, her answer was even more revealing. She stated that stopping them would have looked like an admission of guilt and might have caused residents to question the board's leadership. In other words, she knowingly continued trespassing to protect her image. That statement alone shifted the tone of the entire case. By the time the matter reached court, the HOA's legal posture had weakened significantly. Their attorneys pivoted away from ownership claims and toward damage control. They attempted to frame the situation as a misunderstanding that escalated unnecessarily. They floated the idea of a retroactive easement. They suggested a settlement that would allow limited access in exchange for a modest payment. I declined. This was never about negotiating away my rights. It was about stopping an abuse of power. In court, the narrative the HOA had relied on for months unraveled quickly. The judge focused on one simple question: who owned the land? Once that was established, and it was, conclusively, everything else became secondary. No easement existed. No permission had been granted. No authority had been delegated. The tours were unauthorized. The fees were improperly collected. The continued use after formal notice constituted willful trespass. The HOA president sat through the proceedings without the confident posture she once carried through my fields. There were no tours to lead here. No audience to impress. Just the quiet, unyielding weight of accountability. The ruling was decisive. The court issued an immediate injunction prohibiting the HOA from entering or using my property in any capacity. All promotional materials referencing the land were ordered removed. Any suggestion of community ownership was to be corrected publicly. Then came the damages. The HOA was ordered to repay all profits earned from the tours, along with compensation for environmental damage, cleanup costs, and legal fees. Additional penalties were assessed due to the willful nature of the trespass after formal notice had been given. The total amount was significant enough to send shockwaves through the community. But the consequences didn't stop there. In the weeks that followed, the HOA president resigned. Officially, it was cited as a personal decision. Unofficially, residents were furious. They had donated to a legal fund under false pretenses. They had been misled about the land. They had been told a story that collapsed the moment it encountered truth. Several board members followed her out the door. The tours vanished overnight. The social media posts were deleted. The cheerful announcements replaced by awkward silence and vague statements about restructuring community programs. As for my land, it finally returned to what it had always been meant to be. Quiet. Private. Undisturbed. I repaired the damage. Reinforced the fencing. Installed clearer signage. Not because the court required it, but because I wanted there to be no ambiguity ever again. The boundaries were not just lines on a map. They were lines of respect. Occasionally, I still see people walking near the edge of the trees, stopping short where the HOA once led them through. Some look confused. Others look embarrassed. A few look angry. But none cross the line anymore. The story spread beyond the neighborhood. It became a cautionary tale shared in other communities, whispered in HOA meetings, cited in online forums. A reminder that authority has limits, and those limits are drawn by law, not confidence. For me, the victory wasn't just legal. It was personal. Because land, real land, isn't just about ownership. It's about knowing that when someone decides to take what isn't theirs, whether it's space, money, or control, there is a point where they are forced to stop. And this time, that point was my property line.